In this news roundup of the week, the UK government is fighting calls to bring back COVID restrictions as cases increase. Boris Johnson launched the long-awaited net zero strategy, creating a heated debate about cost. And the EU's constitutional bust-up with Poland threatens to bring the whole structure tumbling down. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. The doomsayers are back, and once again experts are appearing on TV and radio to urge that the government exercise its Plan B on COVID-19 to go back to compulsory mask mandates and working from home, as well as vaccine passports and the rest of it. The Doctors' Trade Union, the British Medical Association, said that the time is now for government to move to Plan B to prevent the NHS being overwhelmed, suggesting that not to do so would constitute willful negligence. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair called for mask mandates and COVID passports to avoid the need for another lockdown. The reason is that infection rates within the UK remain stubbornly high and rising, significantly higher than European neighbours. On Wednesday this week, the government was prompted to hold its first COVID press conference for a month, an event that in the past only ever meant that new restrictions were about to be announced. But for once, that wasn't the story. Health Secretary Sajid Javid has held firm against the early pressure for Plan B, saying that the situation is being carefully monitored, but that he respectfully disagreed with the medical leaders calling for action. Yesterday, the UK saw 50,000 new cases reported across the country, a rise of 17% from the previous week. Javid has said that numbers could go as high as 100,000 a day, a level which was predicted and which the government is understood to believe to be bearable. In a paper published by his institute, Tony Blair made this argument: from an abundance of caution, a sensible sentiment given the history of COVID-19, we believe the government should rapidly and decisively accelerate measures to give us the best possible chance of avoiding the disease spiralling again. Now that seems an odd argument because it implies that what happened in the early waves of COVID-19 could simply just repeat themselves, could happen again. But a lot has changed and not much more is going to change further, notwithstanding the emergence of any significantly different variants. So, if we're saying we should be considering draconian actions today, we're saying we will be considering those actions pretty much forever. We have a largely vaccinated population. Indeed, with natural immunity added in, the UK population is estimated to have 93% of the population with antibodies. If you look at the number of reported cases, they're in the same ballpark as the earliest big wave, for sure. But if you look at how that translates into hospitalisations and deaths, largely not. In January, according to the Daily Telegraph, 30% of hospital beds were occupied by COVID patients. Right now, it's 6%. What doesn't show on those graphs is the 600,000 backlog of patients for other problems that the NHS has to deal with, largely built up because of previous lockdowns. Now, I don't think you should overemphasise that. Much of that disruption would have come to the NHS regardless of the exact nature of lockdowns or non-lockdowns, because many people stay away of their own volition. You get all sorts of changes. It was never a choice just between lockdown on the one hand and everyone going about their business exactly the way they always did before. A point that Anders Tegnell of Sweden has made about their own situation. Even so, we should not just look at those graphs and forget that they only show part of the story. And then the other question is this: why would we assume, when we've had a significantly larger number of cases spreading through younger age groups and the unvaccinated predominantly, why would we assume that what happens next is just further spiralling growth, a further spike in cases? Haven't we actually seen every time that you reach a certain point and then the cases decline, quite often rather sharply? There are certainly a number of those who believe that the UK has simply been going through the same curve earlier on that will follow soon in the rest of Europe as winter arrives in earnest and their later started vaccination programmes begin to wane as the UK's has started to do. They believe that the UK figures will soon start to decline, as they have in the past. After all, look at the US. Just about all of the states there now are seeing declining cases and deaths, including those that performed less well on vaccinations. They saw higher cases and deaths for a while, but then that reaches the end of its cycle and then it naturally declines. It doesn't just keep going and keep exponentially growing. Why would that be different here? You can also add to that the arrival of the first proven effective antiviral pills. The UK this week bought 750,000 treatments of molnupiravir and the new Pfizer treatment. These are to be used with patients who are at significant risk of severe disease. So obviously it remains to be seen how much that will further bring that death rate down in proportion to the case rate. The point is that with diminishing immunity over time, we won't reach some final state of herd immunity at which point COVID goes away. Professor Francois Balloux calculated that given vaccine efficacy, current variants and the estimates of waning immunity, we would average around 20,000 infections a day, presumably with some seasonal variation, my presumption. But we would do that in perpetuity. So you do end up asking the question, if this is not the time now where you live your life normally and accept that there's an endemic disease, which like other endemic diseases might kill you if you're really unlucky. If not now, then when does that time come? Because nothing much now is going to change. What we do need to avoid is the situation in the US where your visible response to possible disease has become part of people's political identity, removing it from pragmatic discussion of benefit and cost. According to one side, mask wearing shows you're a caring liberal, and not doing so shows that you're a callous and stupid Republican. Alternatively, according to the other side, wearing a mask shows that you're a virtue signalling hypocrite, and not doing so shows that you're on the side of free choice. People give up the symbols of identity a lot more reluctantly than you should if you're just being pragmatic about healthcare. We do have some elements of that performative nature in our politics. In the Chamber of the House of Commons, largely Labour politicians wear masks and Conservative ones don't. If you talk to people who attended the party conferences, they say that outside of the main televised areas, the Labour activists and politicians weren't wearing masks either. It was mostly for the cameras. Well, fine. Look, virtue signalling in politics is a thing. It hasn't become such an embedded divide in the wider British public so far, and long may that remain so. Right now, the settled will of the government seems to be to celebrate England being the freest nation in Europe and to see it as an expression of who we are as a country. If they had a record of sticking to their convictions for longer than 2 seconds in the face of pressure, then that would be that. As it is, who knows what happens next? Now, while all that was going on, the UK also launched its long-awaited net zero carbon strategy this week in advance of the COP26 summit in Glasgow. We'll talk about some of the political fallout from that in just a minute. But first, what about the detail of what that strategy actually contains? This is, after all, at last, some specifics behind the government's big promises to decarbonise the economy. You may have seen the headlines, but the headlines never capture the most important details. Now, the UK is rated to be one of the countries furthest ahead on the journey. Some will be looking to it for a practical plan of how you could make a huge transition, let's face it, without handicapping your economy or impoverishing your people. Does it deliver on that, or does it foreshadow problems to come? Since it's both important and topical, then of course we will be taking a deep dive into that in the video going live on this channel next Monday, 7 PM UK time. Join me for that. The detail of what's in the net zero strategy can wait till Monday, but the real focus of the launch of the document wasn't on the majority of the specific details, it was on the question of cost. At least you have to conclude that if you look at the various front page headlines following the launch. And in this case, largely because of the political infighting behind the scenes between Number 10 and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak. The Prime Minister launched the net zero strategy, promising that Britain could achieve net zero without so much as a hair shirt in sight, which is a fine ambition. But as with many of Johnson's statements, it seems based on Tiggerish enthusiasm more than a solid grasp of reality. With the government having spent lavishly in the face of COVID-19 and gotten itself deeply into debt, and with the prospect of higher future interest rates in sight as inflation kicks off, Rishi Sunak is insisting that net zero spending cannot come from additional borrowing, which means it can only be funded by cutting spending elsewhere or raising taxes, which some will say looks quite like hair shirts, really. You have to bear in mind that net zero is already giving the Treasury headaches because the switch to electric vehicles will blow a huge £37 billion a year hole in the country's finances because of the current contribution from fuel duty. Now, okay, if you were to move taxation from fuel duty to, say, road pricing, it doesn't count as new taxation because you're just moving it from one place to another. Overall, Downing Street dismissed cost concerns, saying that the spending is spread over 3 decades and there would be no need for tax rises or cuts in public spending. The Prime Minister argued that the unique creative power of capitalism would produce the cheap and effective technologies needed. The Treasury countered with the argument that while green investment could provide a boost to the economy, it might also displace other more productive investment opportunities and also potentially disadvantage poorer citizens. Which is an obvious point, even if you need to decarbonise. Ignoring the downside while only talking about the upside doesn't constitute rational decision making. And the context of the discussion right now is that the price of energy is through the roof, and those poorer Britons are awaiting the arrival of the evidence of that in their next energy bills. Cost is the new fault line in the net zero discussion, regardless of how much The Guardian and the BBC might prefer to complain about the lack of policy on meat and on flying. That probably suits the government just fine, because all the opposition parties condemn this plan for not going far enough. All of them would spend more. So if the country becomes exercised about cost, the government will potentially suffer the least from that when it comes to the next election. Meanwhile, the EU is facing what some hold to be an existential crisis after Poland's constitutional court ruled that Polish law took precedence over EU law on constitutional matters. This has, on its face, presented the EU with both a constitutional crisis, but also the growing realisation of the fragility of its foundation. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was in full battle mode, saying that she would have to act to stop Poland from undermining EU values. This ruling calls into question the foundations of the European Union. It is a direct challenge to the unity of the European legal order. The Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki accused von der Leyen and the European Court of Justice trying to change the constitutional balance of the EU. Our constitution does not allow us to delegate powers in such a way that our country is no longer a sovereign country. The Polish constitution is the highest legal act in Poland. If you want a sovereign European state, why not ask and get consent? No sovereign state will ever consent to this. The EU would cease to be an association of sovereign states. Now, it hasn't escaped anyone's notice that these are the same arguments that created Brexit. But Poland says it has no intention of leaving, and no mechanism exists to expel a member state from the EU. There are some weapons to hand, though. Von der Leyen said that Poland could be punished with fines, with cuts to EU funding, and the loss of its voting rights unless it falls into line. But the peril of the moment comes from the fact that Poland's constitutional case isn't without merit, nor indeed without precedent. Challenging the supremacy of EU courts is something that even the German Constitutional Court has done. Just last year, the Germans were accused of undermining the very foundations of the EU legal order over a challenge to the EU Central Bank's quantitative easing programme. But Poland's more profound, wide-ranging challenge really does expose legal weaknesses that everyone else was just kind of ignoring. This principle of EU legal supremacy is hard to source. It certainly wasn't established in the original 1957 Treaty of Rome, the founding document for the bloc, nor was it established by any of the subsequent treaties. It was first introduced by the European Court of Justice itself in a 1964 court case, Costa versus NL. It was never endorsed by the EU nations, but people simply behaved as though it had legal weight. The EU member countries had an opportunity to explicitly recognise EU supremacy in law in the Lisbon Treaty, which is what finally emerged after an initial attempt at framing a constitution for Europe. But the article establishing EU legal supremacy, which was in the earlier version, was dropped in the final version. It was instead put into an annex which simply noted that the principle had been established by the Court of Justice. According to the court, this principle is inherent to the specific nature of the European community. That seems like a circular argument. A court declares that its laws have primacy, but then if it's wrong, then its declaration carries no legal weight. So, Poland, and in its more restrained way Germany, are not wrong to argue that the EU could be seen as changing the rules to suit themselves without consent. It's a threat because they may prove to be putting their finger on the fault line that still exists in the EU. Because Brexit was arguably the canary in the coal mine, it wasn't the resolution of the problem. Constitutional weaknesses will eventually always get discovered and exploited by someone willing to test the rules by breaking them. One to watch. In a minute, we'll get to some final headlines, but first, it's time for a monthly update video where we look back on some of the issues that I've covered here over recent months, see what people are saying about them, what new developments have arisen. It will, as always, be fast-paced and highly topical, so join me for that video, going live on this channel at 7 PM UK time Wednesday next week. See you for that. Oh, and if you made it this far, I guess you're kind of enjoying this content. So if you've not yet subscribed, why not hit that red button and the bell, of course, so that you get notified of videos when they arrive. And go on, hit the like button as well. China startled the US intelligence community this week as news emerged that it had tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile that circled the Earth in low-orbit space. The fact that it missed its target by 20 miles isn't being held as much comfort as people digested the realisation that such a weapon, able to travel at 5 times the speed of sound, would be difficult if not impossible to defend against. The Financial Times quoted intelligence sources as saying that the test showed that China had made astounding progress on hypersonic weapons and was far more advanced than US officials realised. One official admitted, "We have no idea how they did this." China has denied that it was a missile test at all, a denial which doesn't seem to be being given much credence by commentators so far. President Trump has announced the launch of his own social media channel. Wait, didn't this already happen twice before? Well, this time it's really his, as opposed to the one that was just a blog, and then the Twitter alternative Getter that was launched in his orbit, but he never quite lined up behind. Truth Social is what it's called. Trump said this, "I created Truth Social and TMTG to stand up to the tyranny of big tech. We live in a world where the Taliban has a huge presence on Twitter, yet your favourite American president has been silenced. This is unacceptable." A beta launch of the site for invited guests is expected in November, with a full launch in the first quarter of 2022. Now, while I've taken Trump as I found him on politics, I have had a history of relentlessly mocking and predicting failure for his proposed social media channel. So you may be harbouring the belief that I would automatically be dismissive of this latest launch. And you would be bang on. The fact that it's been given as stupid a name as Truth Social says to me that Trump named it himself. Ridiculous hubris and not a good sign. My argument is the same as always. Any social media channel seen as the vehicle for Trump will attract only politically minded Trump supporters, which is fine, but it's not a proposition for a social media channel which needs to attract a critical mass of creators and contributors. If it's been designed well, rather than also by Trump personally, then it might limp along like Parler and Getter, a minority back channel where one niche group talks to itself. Which may be fine for Parler, but Trump is trying to replace the reach that he had on Twitter, 89 million followers, and many more who would then share his words in their outrage, so unwittingly serving his purposes. The ability he had to dominate the news agenda through his latest tweet. This won't give him that. Still, even if his venture crashes and burns spectacularly, it's probably still going to do better than the image of the city of Glasgow. When it was named as the host of the COP26 climate summit, the thinking was that it would be able to showcase the best of British, the city of culture. Between what's been described as shambolic organisation and then the opportunistic actions by various unions, the result is turning out to be the exact opposite. Refuse workers and train drivers have seized the opportunity to go on strike, meaning that delegates will have to contend with piles of rubbish in the streets, a resulting plague of rats, gridlocked roads and cancelled trains. Those gridlocked roads will be made worse, no doubt, by climate protesters, who were promised by the Assistant Chief Constable that police would be fair, friendly and accommodating to protesters, at least before the backlash forced Police Scotland to insist that protesters would not be allowed to disrupt the conference. And a chronic shortage of accommodation in Glasgow, which you'd think would have been considered when choosing a venue, means that hotel rooms are charging 3,000% of their usual rates. Add to that the shambolic organisation of the conference itself, which has provoked protests and criticisms from conference sponsors and old hands at COP conferences complaining that clueless bureaucrats with zero experience of such events have been put in charge. And that's before you even get to the grim prospect for any kind of substantial agreement to come out of the thing. Last week, as I was finishing editing Friday's video, the news came through that the Conservative MP David Amess had been stabbed to death at his regular surgery with constituents. These are the sort of events that bring out both the best and the worst of British politics. The best, just about all politicians across the political divide were united in condemning the action, were generous in their praise of Amess, regardless of their political differences. Amess was universally described as someone who was kind, gentle, nice to everyone, regardless of their politics. It was a tragic, horrible event, taking the life of a decent man, an active supporter of his community, and the heart of a loving family. The worst was there to be seen as well, of course. You could seek out the tweets of the opposition MPs to see their dignified and heartfelt testament, and then you could read all the responses from people for whom politics is a dehumanizing process. A kind man, a nice man, don't be stupid, he was a Tory, they said. By definition, that precludes him from being any of those things. Work out various flavours of that theme on a downward spiral of inhumanity and viciousness, and you get the idea. Well, on the one hand, so what? Idiots say idiotic things on Twitter, and it's not real life. But yes, something like this should be a prompt to try to put the humanity back into political discourse. Not because of the event itself, which was a terrorist attack, but precisely because of those dehumanised reactions to it. When you see people as less than human, you can feel like a moral person while sneering in the face of their death. And of course, when you see people as less than human, you can justify in your own mind taking violent action against them. So it's not a surprise that such trolls have become a serious talking point in the aftermath, even to the extent where we run the risk of overreacting by rushing a rather fraught piece of legislation on online harms. We'll come back to that another time. The more immediate and relevant point is access. In the UK, we have the proud tradition that members of Parliament regularly make themselves available to meet the people they represent. And they listen to their problems, their opinions, and they try to help. Now, some do that better than others, no doubt, but it's a system that, by design, keeps them in touch with the lives and experiences of people, makes it harder for them to become themselves detached and to take a dehumanising attitude. It's not perfect, of course, no system ever is. But it's significant that out of the various responses to the tragedy, one of the most common I've seen is parliamentarians and former parliamentarians saying that, yes, maybe something needs to be improved about security, but it mustn't be allowed to prevent that casual, frequent, close contact that is so important to the whole system. Now, people who disdained contact with ordinary people would be jumping all over this as an excuse not to have to do it. They're not. And that should give us hope. If we're all in our bunkers, afraid of the world, then the political process as we know it would be lost to us. All right. A number of people signed up to become Patreon supporters after last week. My thanks to them and, of course, to my long-standing supporters there. It is immensely encouraging when YouTube continues to constrain how this channel gets promoted to new non-subscriber audiences. Someone asked me this week if the other news channels that I've mentioned before that were hit the same way at the same time as this one were still showing that was the case for them. And indeed it is. Again, it seems to be about news and politics, channels generally, more than it is your political viewpoint. So Maya Tuzi on the political right has been hit from the exact same time, March the 6th this year. So too has Tom Hartman on the political left. And then there's me on the alt centre, perhaps. Unfortunately hit in the same way at a rather earlier stage in my growth than those two esteemed gentlemen. Now, look, I don't mention this to moan about it. It is what it is. We are going to break through it. I still think that focusing in on good content will eventually overcome. But just to underline how much I really do owe to all of my regular audience, of course, who I appreciate deeply, and especially to those Patreon supporters. Without them especially, I would have to pivot to do content more likely to be promoted by YouTube. I mean, puppies or something, I guess. And it would be unlikely that I could do the quantity of videos that I do. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.